This is Mike Tatarsky, host of the Vietnam Weekly podcast, coming to you from Ho Chi Minh City. So, due to scheduling issues, I don't actually have a new episode today. Such is life when it's a one-man team and people are busy. But it just so happens that the government recently approved 2 regulations on topics discussed on previous episodes. So I'm taking this chance to revisit parts of those shows in the context of these developments. The first is the new law on social insurance, which the National Assembly passed on June 29th. Tu Phuong Nguyen joined me back in February to talk about Vietnam's social insurance system and the issue of blue-collar workers withdrawing the full amount of their social insurance fund after quitting. Here she is providing background on previous reform efforts and the options being considered by lawmakers earlier this year when we recorded.
The government actually started to try to reduce the number of early withdrawals in 2014 and 2015. So at that time, there was a revised law passed that no longer allow employees to withdraw social insurance 1 year after they quit their job. The law was met with protests from workers. Thousands of workers in a footwear company in Ho Chi Minh City protested against the law, and there was also widespread discontent by workers reported in the south of Vietnam. So the workers' protests prompted the government to hold dialogues with them and to reverse the change in the law, which means that workers are still able to withdraw their social insurance as before. And on the other hand, the government is also increasing the communication campaign in the media through activities of the unions and the local authorities. They are trying to communicate with workers about the benefits of pension, the benefits of continuous contribution to social insurance. And they also talk about the disadvantages that workers would face if they withdraw social insurance early. But it looks like that the campaign hasn't been very effective in stemming or reducing the rise in early withdrawals. And recently, the government is trying to change the law again. The legal reform is actually underway, and the draft law is going to be debated at the next legislative meeting. And if it is passed, it will come into effect in 2025. So this time, the government is having a more cautious approach to changing the law because they don't want to repeat the mistake that was made in 2014, 2015, right? So there have been a few proposals that are meant to reduce the number of early withdrawals. The most recent ones being considered are the first one is that the employees can withdraw the social insurance premiums early, but they can only obtain up to 50% of their total contributions. And this option is evaluated by the government to offer a balanced approach, right? So if workers need the money in the short term, they can still access the money, but they can only access half of it. And then the rest will remain with the state. So, for example, in the future, workers rejoin the social insurance fund again, they will have something to contribute to, and that will help pay towards their pensions in the future. Another option, but then that first option, the problem with that first option is that workers may not be very happy with it because it reduces the money that they would think that they will be able to claim. So the second option that the government is considering is that the law will remain the same for existing participants in social insurance, but for new participants, those who join social insurance after 2025, after the new law comes into effect, they won't be able to withdraw social insurance within 1 year after they quit their job. So this option is evaluated as something that would be as being more effective to change the attitude of workers, the mindset of workers, and to reduce the number of social insurance withdrawals in the long term, but in the short term, it may not be very effective because current people who are part of the system who are currently participating in the system can still withdraw the money.
To quote Tu's LinkedIn post, after the passage of this law, the revised regulation states that, quote, people who join the social insurance system from 1 July 2025 can't withdraw their pension after quitting their job unless they move overseas, have serious illnesses, disabilities, and reduced work capacity. This is the second option that you just heard explained by Tu. To continue her post, quote, that means 18 million people who have already been in the system and those who will join it before July 1st, 2025, can still withdraw their pension after quitting their job. It's yet unclear how the new law may give way to measures that can encourage these people to remain in the system, especially those living on low income, which has been the main reason for early withdrawals, end quote. So Tu mentioned people with low incomes, and why would they pursue these early withdrawals? That's something we discussed back in February as well.
There are different scenarios in which workers would need that lump sum, the social insurance lump sum. The first, and I think the most common reason is job losses, as we've discussed before. The second reason is that workers are caught in financial and economic difficulty. And they think that, if they have a large amount of money, then they will help the family, for example, to pay debt, to pay for children's education, to pay for accommodations, etc. So what they do is that they quit their formal employment and then they switch to working casually or working in informal employment. And then 1 year later, they claim the lump sum, which is a huge amount of money that can help them with their family. Yeah, so there are different scenarios in which workers would need to access the money, and usually that is often the last resort for people who are caught in economic and financial difficulties.
Well, the impact of this new law remains to be seen, and its implementation is just under a year away. Tu was skeptical of this approach, both on social media and in our conversation. She wrote online that, quote, it's high time that they being the government, tackle business violations of social insurance, make the system more accountable, and regain trust and confidence from employees that have eroded badly during the contentious legal revision process, end quote. She also explained the reactive, rather than proactive, reform effort that has led to what she considers, quote, paradoxical policies that leave many unanswered questions.
I think that the reform this time brings us to an ongoing and persistent challenge of workers' precariousness. And that is a good thing. But I think the way that the government approaches the problem is a bit problematic. I mean, if the problem is about workers' precariousness, then I think the solution would be more to do with supporting them in their income, in their job, and in their livelihood. The options or the proposals that I have mentioned before for this current legal reform, all of these options are paradoxical in a way that the government would want to balance various objectives, balance the objective of, reducing social insurance withdrawals and then maintaining social order, which is basically about, changing the law without creating social backlash or without upsetting the workers who would benefit from the law. The paradox is that if the legal reform is meant to benefit the workers, then why do they keep opting out of the system? Why do they keep withdrawing the money, right? So because the legal reform process creates so much uncertainty about whether or not in the future workers can or cannot withdraw their social insurance money, there has been news about many workers in garment factories resigning from their jobs so they can withdraw the money before the new law comes into effect. So I think that is the paradox of the legal reform that hasn't been much discussed about in the formal policy discourse. And as I'm back to the issue that I mentioned previously about how the problem should be approached, I think that the proposals being put forth this time are mostly reactive rather than constructive. And I think that more meaningful or constructive measures should be about how to improve workers' livelihood, how to support them better in their job, in their employment, and in their welfare on an everyday basis. And that is particularly crucial for migrant workers who move from the rural to the urban areas to find jobs. They have faced challenges in accessing public services in the destination cities or provinces.
I haven't seen too much reaction to this yet from industry or domestic media, but this topic will surely surface again as we approach July 1st, 2025. Now, shifting gears entirely to the energy sector. Last Wednesday, the Ministry of Industry and Trade issued its long-awaited decree on the Direct Power Purchase Agreement, or DPPA. This was a focal point of my May conversation with Giles Cooper, a partner at Allen's in Hanoi. As a refresher, here he is explaining what exactly a DPPA is.
So at its most simplest form, a DPPA is simply the ability of a consumer to purchase renewable energy directly and to be able to essentially prove that it is purchasing renewable energy.
So they would be buying from like a solar farm instead of going through the national grid?
Yeah, exactly. So the way that the model has developed over time in Vietnam is that there are two sort of aspects to the DPPA that are proposed, or two sort of models that exist within the same program. And the first model is that there is what they call a physical DPPA, and that, as you might imagine, is where there is a direct wire linking the generation plant, so a solar or wind plant in particular, a direct wire from that generation facility to the consumer, and the consumer buys directly the power that is generated by that facility. So that's one aspect of it, and then there's another aspect as well, and it's called the virtual element to the DPPA, and it's virtual because there's not a direct link between, or a direct wire between the generator and the consumer. Instead, the consumer stays connected to the grid in its normal way. It purchases electricity from its EVN retailer as normal, but it enters into something called a contract for difference with the generator, and that's just purely a contractual arrangement. The generator sells its electricity into the wholesale market, so it sells into the grid, sells to EVN, and that electricity, the actual electrons generated by that project could effectively go anywhere. But from at a contractual level between the generator and the consumer, they have an agreement where they sort of support the price of that renewable energy, and ultimately the generator will provide renewable energy certificates to the consumer to evidence the use of the renewable energy.
While solar will likely be the initial focus for businesses operating under the DPPA, it also covers wind, biomass, micro-hydropower, geothermal, wave, and tidal energy plants, though several of those don't exist in Vietnam yet. The DPPA is restricted to businesses using power for production and that consume at least 200,000 kilowatt hours per month. For reference, the average household uses just a few hundred kilowatt hours every month. According to EVN, about 7,700 of its customers meet this threshold and account for 36.5% of Vietnam's total electricity consumption. Solar and wind energy suppliers, meanwhile, must have a capacity of at least 10 megawatts to take part in this framework, ruling out the small-scale rooftop solar you'll hear Giles mention a little later. While the DPPA process may sound straightforward, it took 7 years to become a reality, and represents a significant evolution in Vietnam's electricity market, as Giles goes on to describe.
And I think listeners really have to understand just how dramatic a change something like the DPPA is. On the one hand, it's relatively simple. A consumer is able to buy renewable energy. That sounds great. It sounds easy. But fundamentally, it's a very, very dramatic shift in the way the market functions. As probably many of your listeners know, Vietnam has essentially a state-integrated monopoly in transmission and sale of power. So there are some minor exceptions to that, and small rooftop projects have been one of those exceptions. Industrial zones, there are some other exceptions, but typically and generally, all electricity users around the country have to purchase from EVN, and they will transmit all the electricity as well. So it really is a very dramatic market shift to allow the private sector to participate in the transmission, but also the sale of large amounts of renewable energy. And that's a key reason why it's taken so long, because it's been very complicated to integrate it into the regulatory environment, and in particular against the backdrop of all the developments and changes that have been happening in the energy market over the last couple of years.
So this is a big deal, and major energy consumers will be pleased by the DPPA's arrival. Energy-hungry foreign investors like Samsung have pushed for this regulation for years, and it's important to get an idea of why.
I mean, there's a variety of different factors. There's sort of a number of push and pull factors. I mean, on the push front, a lot of these companies have made, global renewable energy commitments where they commit to use a certain amount, often up to 100% renewable energy by a certain date, and that date is often, for many of them, 2030. For some European companies, it's even earlier than that. So, their operations around the world, they've made commitments that they will use renewable energy by certain dates. So they essentially have obligated themselves to ensure that is possible. And of course, there's a range of various commitments and flex on that, perhaps amongst the different users. But fundamentally, they're obliged, and they wish to meet those commitments. So that's a big push factor for them to get involved and to promote these schemes. Another one that is sort of a push factor is related to, carbon costs and carbon taxes. The one most often talked about around here is the European Union Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, where, in a nutshell, if you are, if you're using, or if you're not able to show that your power sources are such that you're meeting the European regulations on the carbon use throughout your production chain, then you'll have to pay more to get your products distributed in the European market. And there are a number of other schemes like that around the world. So those sort of factors push companies to get involved with DPPA. But there are also pull factors as well, such as, for example, the cost and the reliability of the energy. On the cost point. Most research shows and most commentators believe that ultimately you'll be able to pay less for electricity. You'll be able to enter into a fixed long-term contract with the generator where you can fix your costs. You'll have cost certainty for power over 15, 20 years, up to maybe even longer. Whereas, of course, if you're just purchasing from the grid, you don't have that cost certainty. Costs will fluctuate, and of course they are going up here, and they probably need to go up quite a bit more just to meet market basics, let alone the future cost escalation that is likely. So that's a pull factor, but also the reliability of the power. I mean, as is widely reported, last year there were power disruptions in the north that affected manufacturers quite severely. They are forecast again this year. And who knows, maybe next year as well. So if you are able to do a deal with an offsite generator that, you can pretty much assure a certain percentage of your power, then, you have a lot of comfort on that as well. So there's a variety of factors.
Now that DPPA is here, what kind of impact can we anticipate? To paraphrase Giles, be patient.
The most immediate impact will probably be that everyone needs to study very carefully how they can participate in this. And by that I mean, so for the really large projects and the virtual projects, first of all, you still need to comply with all the general planning on and approval and permitting of the facility. So, future greenfield projects that are going to be designed to participate directly in this, will have quite a long runway that they need to work through to ensure that they can actually implement the projects. So on the one hand, it'll be quite a slow process, I believe, to roll out the major projects. On the other hand, I think if indeed it is confirmed ultimately that rooftop solar projects will be able to participate, then we will see, I think, very rapid take-up of that element at least. As I say, it won't meet the needs of all the customers and the consumers immediately, but it will be an important step for them to take rapidly.
Yeah, I guess that's good advice generally when it comes to new regulations. Study it carefully. So 2 unrelated but highly impactful regulations that I'll be tracking over time, and I hope to revisit them with both Tu and Giles in the future. That's it for this week's episode of the Vietnam Weekly podcast. As always, if you have any comments, feedback, or guest ideas, get in touch at matatarsky@gmail.com. Connect with the Vietnam Weekly on Threads, LinkedIn, or Instagram. Thank you so much for listening, and please rate or review the show on your preferred podcast platform. And see you next week.